We began this current sermon series, I guess, 6 weeks ago. And a lot has happened in our world in the last 6 weeks, hasn't it? A lot of things have happened. We had a guy over in Nice, France, drive into a crowd of people, a terrorist, and kill 84 people and injure, I think, about 300 people more than that. We had a homicide bomber over in Kabul, Afghanistan, who killed 84 people. Just this week, there was a French priest who was beheaded by ISIS knife men. And even here in our country, we have all kinds of horrible things going on, don't we? I think in the last 6 weeks, we've had about 20 police officers killed here in this country. And in the last 6 weeks, both political parties have had their conventions, and both of them nominated people that, at best, are deeply flawed candidates. People who are probably the most disliked candidates in the history of the United States. People who are being investigated and have lawsuits against them and all kinds of things. And when we look around and we see all those things, what we find is that the one thing that hasn't changed in the last 6 weeks is the fact that there's a lot of things that we can worry about in this world around us. I mean, face it, if we look around, there's plenty to worry about. That hasn't really changed. But the other thing that hasn't changed is that we don't have to worry about those things. We don't have to be anxious about those things because we have a shepherd who loves us and who meets all of our needs and who takes care of us. When we began 6 weeks ago, we began this series by saying this, that if Jesus is my shepherd, I have everything I need. And that's still true, isn't it, 6 weeks later? And it'll be true 6 weeks from now and 6 years from now, and if the Lord tarries 600 years from now, that if we have Jesus as our shepherd, then we have everything that we need. And this morning, as we conclude this series of sermons on Psalm 23, and we come to verse 6, we're going to see that David really brings this whole psalm full circle, and he comes back to a very similar thing at the end of his psalm and says something very similar, only slightly in a different way. And so here's what it says in Psalm 23, verse 6. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And I think here's the main idea that we find in David's closing verse. If I pursue the shepherd, then goodness and mercy will pursue me. If I pursue the shepherd, then goodness and mercy are going to pursue me. And this morning we're going to look at some practical steps to see how, in fact, that we can make sure that in our lives that we are pursuing the shepherd in a way that mercy and goodness will pursue us. But before we do that, there's some terms here, some words that we find here in this verse that I think are really important that we take some time to define them because they're crucial to really understanding what David's writing here. The first one is the word follow. And in English, that's kind of a passive verb in a lot of ways. I mean, we play follow the leader or something like that. And I don't think we get the full sense of the word. And the word that's used there in Hebrew, it really means to pursue closely. I think probably the best way to illustrate this is a roller coaster. You know, on a roller coaster, you have all these cars that are together. And if you're not in the first car, if you're in one of those cars behind that, you hope that it pursues the car in front of it, don't you? Because if it gets separated, there's a problem there. And that's really what the word that David uses here, what it means. It means to pursue that closely, to hang on to closely. And that's why this morning I've used the word pursue rather than just follow, because I think it gives us a better sense of what David writes here. And what is pursuing us? He says that goodness and mercy will pursue us. So we need to define those terms. First of all, what is goodness? Goodness means those things that are good and pleasant and beautiful, agreeable. I think maybe a good synonym for that would be that it refers to all of God's blessings, those good things that He pours into our lives. And then there's the word mercy. It's a it's an interesting word. It's used all throughout the Old Testament. Usually in the ESV, it's translated steadfast love. And the idea there is it's tied up with God's forgiveness for us and the fact that He loves us in spite of who we are. It might be helpful to think of them like this, that goodness is how God supplies all the needs in my life, and that mercy is how God takes care of all my sin and faults in my life. Now, I don't know about you, but I want to experience a life like that. Don't you? A life in which goodness and mercy are pursuing me. They're hanging on to me like that car on the roller coaster. I want to live a life like that. And the good thing is that kind of life is available to me if I just make Jesus the shepherd of my life, if I'll pursue Him in every single area of my life. So how do I do that? How do I, how do I pursue the shepherd in every area of my life in a way that goodness and mercy are going to pursue me? I want to share with you this morning 3 things that we find here in this passage. The first thing I have to do is I have to pursue the shepherd for who He is and not what He can give me. I need to pursue Him for who He is and not what He can give me. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this service, the sermon series here, that Psalm 23, most of the times we find it used, tends to be at a funeral or a memorial service. And I think the reason is because of verse 6 here, where David writes, "And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." But I'm not sure that once we really look at this, that's exactly what David's referring to here when he does that. I mean, it seems like he's talking about eternal life here, but maybe that's not exactly what's going on. I mean, I think it's possible, certainly. But let's just take a look at it. Let's look first at the word forever. Now, if you're using the ESV translation, which some of you are, there's a little footnote there, right? And what does that footnote say that the underlying Hebrew literally says there? Does anyone have that? It means length of days. You might find that. I don't know about you guys, but in my Bible, I can't even read the footnotes. I think they're so tiny. But that's what it says. It says that forever literally means length of days. And we've already talked about the fact that in Hebrew poetry that there's a lot of parallelism. We call it like rhyming thoughts. So if you look at verse 6 where he says, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the Lord of the house for length of days," I think there's a parallel there, that days of my life and length of days are forever, that they're presenting parallel thoughts is what David's doing there. So that really this idea of forever, length of days, they're both referring to his life here on earth and not just somewhere way down the road. Now, I'll admit, if that's all we had, that would be a pretty weak case for that. But I think there's some other things here that can help us accurately determine what David is speaking of here. Next phrase I want to call your attention to is that phrase, the house of the Lord. Now, if you believe that this is dealing with the afterlife, then the house of the Lord has to be referring to what? To heaven and to the afterlife. And I'll admit that's possible. That's certainly possible. But from what we know about David and his time and the thinking of that time and the Hebrew thinking, they didn't have a really well-developed idea of what heaven and what eternal life was all about. We really only get that deeper understanding when we see what we have in the New Testament, where we find much more detail about what that's going to be like to live forever in the presence of God. But it's possible that it meant it, so it could have meant heaven. David could have been referring here to the tabernacle. We know he wasn't referring to the temple because, why? The temple hasn't been built yet when David's writing this. I mean, he might have been looking forward to it. It's possible. So he could have been talking about the tabernacle, which was the place where people thought that God's presence came and dwelled, which it did, but his dwelling wasn't limited, obviously, to that place. So it could have been the tabernacle. I think what he's referring to here is we know that the word house can also mean household or family. So what he's really saying here is that I'm going to dwell in the household of the Lord for the length of my days. And if that's in fact what he's doing here, it would focus on his relationship with God. And I think I can make a pretty good case from the Scriptures themselves that that's what David was doing here. We can go and look at some other Psalms that David wrote. and see how he uses some similar wording. In one case, we're going to see wording that's almost exactly what we find here in Psalm 23. And we're going to see that that's really what David's focus was here. Let's look first at Psalm 65, verse 4. David wrote these words, "Blessed is the one who you choose and bring near to dwell," there's the word dwell, "to dwell in your courts. We shall be satisfied with the goodness of your house, the holiness of your temple." Now, I got to just point out, we're going to look at a couple of these verses that refer to temple, and the word there doesn't necessarily have to mean God's temple there in Jerusalem. It's a word that just it could mean palace. So it's kind of a broader word. So David's not necessarily referring to the temple that Solomon built here, because it's not built yet. But you'll notice here that he talks about this idea of dwelling in God's courts. And we know that in the tabernacle, nobody actually dwelled within the courts of the tabernacle. Now, there were some priests and some Levites who served there, and they would dwell in some areas pretty close to there because they wanted to be convenient to their services, but nobody really dwelled in the house. So it doesn't seem like David is really referring here to a physical place. He's not referring to heaven almost for sure here in this passage. But what he is doing is referring to this relationship in which people draw near to God. Let's look at another one. Psalm 26, verse 8. "O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells." Now, once again, David's not worrying about some physical place. As I mentioned just a moment ago, God's glory doesn't just dwell in some building. It didn't just dwell in the temple. It didn't just dwell in the tabernacle. So what David is saying here, he says, I love to be in your presence. That's really what he's saying here. He's focusing on his relationship with God. This idea of pursuing God in every area of his life. One last one, and this is the one that's most directly applicable here. It's in Psalm 27, verse 4. It says, "One thing I've asked of the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." Man, that almost sounds exactly like Psalm 23, verse 6, doesn't it? Except that instead of saying forever or for length of days here, he says, all the days of my life. So David's not just concerned about dwelling with God and pursuing him somewhere down the road after he dies. He's saying, I want to pursue him. I want to live with him. I want to have a relationship while I'm with him here on this earth. Not just way down the road sometime. It's also interesting here that, again, he's not worried about some physical location or a place to be. It's all about his relationship with God here. And I think you see that in Psalm 23. Look how David begins and ends Psalm 23. Remember, he begins it, he says, "The Lord is my shepherd." And then he ends it with, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord. There's the Lord there again, forever, for length of days. I think what David's doing, he's wrapping this psalm up with these words that say, look, above anything else in my life, I want to pursue God. I want to have a personal, intimate relationship with the shepherd, because I know that is what takes care of my life. That's how I get all these other blessings in my life. David knew he would get the blessings, but here's the thing. He wasn't pursuing the shepherd because of what he was going to get. He was pursuing the shepherd just because he loved him and because he wanted to have this close, intimate relationship with him. So if I pursue the shepherd, then goodness and mercy will pursue me. And in order for that to happen, I have to make sure that I'm pursuing God just for who he is and not because I'm going to get something from him. The second thing I have to do is I have to put my confidence completely in God. Put my confidence completely in God. Look at this short video here that tells us why that's so important.
My shepherd. I'm looking at the camera while I'm doing the Bible verse.
Okay, good.
Why don't you look in the camera too?
Oh, okay.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for You are with me. Your rod and Your staff, they comfort me. Surely, prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Now You anoint my head with oil. Surely,
My cup.
my cup, okay. My cup overflows. Surely, yes. Surely, goodness will follow me all the days of my
Surely
life.
goodness and love
Surely, goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
She was really anxious to get to the word surely, wasn't she? And I think maybe she's onto something there. Because in a sense, that's really what this psalm is all about, is about how we can have this tremendous confidence in God. The word surely is actually a really interesting word in Hebrew. I did some study on it this week. It functions as an adverb, but this little 2-letter Hebrew word really, it functions more like an exclamation point, really, rather than meaning surely. And we can see that in another one of the Psalms that David wrote. In Psalm 62, he wrote these words: "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From Him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken." Now, it's really interesting. See the word alone there? Same Hebrew word that's translated surely in Psalm 23. And the reason is because really all that word is intended to do is to bring emphasis to something, to call attention to it, to be, like I say, like an exclamation point. So really, if we wanted to translate this verse, we could almost translate it something like this: "For God," with all these exclamation points. Dave, if you can go to the next slide. There you go, next. "For God," exclamation point, "my soul waits in silence. He," explanation point, "is my rock and my salvation." The idea here is that David just wants to draw attention to God, to the reason that he can have this confidence in God. So it's almost like just putting exclamation points there. So similarly, we could translate Psalm 23:6 like this: exclamation points, a whole bunch of them, "Goodness and mercy shall pursue me, shall follow me all the days of my life." What David is saying here, he's saying it's a sure thing. It's going to happen for sure. And he wants to call attention not to himself, but to the God that he has confidence in, because that's the reason that he knows for sure that goodness and mercy are going to follow him all the days of his life. He wanted his readers to understand that he had 100% confidence in God. He had 100% confidence that goodness and mercy would follow him all the days of his life, not because he had deserved it, not because he'd done anything to earn it or to merit it, but strictly based on the character and nature of God, because he knew that he could depend 100% on that. See, he understood that if he pursued the shepherd, that goodness and mercy would pursue him. And pursuing the shepherd in every area of my life is only possible if I have 100% confidence in God. But what does that look like? How do I live in my life if I have that 100% confidence in God? What should that look like? And here's what I would suggest is at least one of the attributes of that kind of life, is that I obey the shepherd even when it doesn't make sense. That I obey the shepherd even when it doesn't make sense. You know, doing that, obeying the shepherd even when it doesn't make sense, that's both the way that I develop my confidence in God and the way that I demonstrate my confidence in God. When I'm able to obey those things that just don't make a whole lot of sense to me. A few weeks ago, when we looked at this passage on Monday morning, we discussed how this idea of dwelling in the presence of God is really, it's talked about in the New Testament by Jesus, and and especially by John in a little different sense, they use the term abiding. It's this idea of having this close relationship with Jesus that allows us to get all the benefits of Him being our shepherd. Here's what Jesus spoke about abiding in John chapter 15. He said, "Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing." Now, I would give to you that the words dwell and abide have slightly different meanings. But I'd also say if you stuck the word dwell in that passage every time that Jesus said abide, you get pretty much the same meaning, wouldn't you? It's that idea of living, having this close relationship with Jesus here. And in both dwelling and abiding, they're not about a specific place. They're about a relationship that we have with God. And so when John writes a letter to the church several years later, I think he had to very much have in mind what Jesus said there just hours before he went to the cross when he talked about abiding to him. So here's what John wrote in 1 John chapter 2. "And by this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, 'I know him,' but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked." Now it's pretty easy, isn't it, to say, "I have confidence in Jesus." I can say that. But you know how I demonstrate it? I demonstrate it by obeying his commands and by walking the way he walked, even when that doesn't make sense to my finite human mind. I remember the first time that I ever flew in an airplane. I was a little bit apprehensive. I mean, I'm getting into this big metal tube that's full of people and luggage and fuel, and somehow this thing is supposed to get off the ground. But because I had seen other planes fly, and because my parents said, "Hey, it's going to be okay," I trusted that even though that didn't make sense to me, that flying tube was actually going to get off the ground. And guess what? It did. So I'm thankful for that. So this year when we got ready to go on vacation again, we got on the plane. I wasn't really apprehensive, but I got to tell you that it still doesn't make sense to me that we get on this Boeing 767 that's filled up with people and luggage and fuel. From what I understand, that it could weigh probably at takeoff close to 400,000 pounds. And that somehow that thing's going to get off the ground again. I mean, it still doesn't make sense to my mind. But because I've flown before, because I've seen other planes fly, I could trust that it actually would. And guess what? It did. And the result is we ended up landing in a beautiful place of paradise because of trusting in that plane. I think that's a pretty good picture of what it means to abide in the shepherd. It means that even when we don't understand exactly how things work, even when things don't make sense in these human minds of ours, that we choose to follow Jesus anyway. I mean, think about it. There's a lot of his commands that don't make much sense from a human standpoint, do they? I'm supposed to pray for my enemy. I'm supposed to love my enemy. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. That's not the way my mind operates. I'm supposed to go ahead and to make a financial contribution to my church even when I don't know how I'm going to pay for my own bills. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense in my mind. How about this one? Does it really make sense that the way that I'm going to trust my entire future to God is by trusting in some guy that died on a cross and then came back to life? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to my human mind. But when I trust those things, when I believe in them, in spite of the fact that I don't understand everything, guess what? Goodness and mercy pursue me if I'm willing to pursue God like that. I got to tell you, I haven't always obeyed Jesus perfectly in the past. None of us here have we? But I can tell you this, every single time that I have, goodness and mercy have pursued me. Even though that didn't make sense in my life. See, if I pursue the shepherd, then goodness and mercy will pursue me. But the only way that can happen is I have to be willing to obey the shepherd even when it doesn't make sense. There's a lot to worry about, a lot to have anxiety about in our culture around us, isn't it? Wouldn't you like to live a life that's free from worry and anxiety? One where you're not too busy for the most important things in life. One in which your relationship with God is restored when you wander away from Him. One where you can live with confidence in God, even in the presence of your enemies. I know I'd like to live a life like that. And my guess is that all of us here would like to live a life like that. But it's not an easy thing to do, is it? There's so many things pulling us away from that kind of life. And if we try to do it in our own strength and our own power, we might be able to do it for a short period of time, but certainly not in the long run. But the good news is, if Jesus is your shepherd, then as we've seen for these last 6 weeks, then you have everything that you need. And so you can live with confidence in the midst of a world that wants to drag us into worry and anxiety. Jesus made that possible for all of us through His life and His death and His resurrection. But the thing is, He won't force us to live that kind of life. We have to choose to cooperate with Him in living that kind of life. So as we close this morning, I want to challenge all of us to really consider carefully 2 decisions that we need to make in our life. The first one is this: if you've never made Jesus your Lord, then He's not your shepherd. We talked about that several weeks ago. And so if you've never made Jesus the Lord of your life, if you've never committed your life to Him fully, if you're not trusting in Jesus Christ alone for your salvation and for your relationship with God, then this morning I just want to beg you, please don't leave here today until you've got that right with God. Now, I'm not going to ask you to just raise your hand this morning if you want to do that. I'm not even going to ask you to bow your head and just pray some prayer after me, because that's a decision that's far too important for you to make without understanding everything that's involved in that. But if you've never made that decision before, I would love to sit down and talk to you more about how you can do that. I want you to understand and to know for sure that Jesus is your shepherd. So if that describes where you're at in your life, please don't leave here this morning until we've talked about that. You can come talk to me after the service. If you're too intimidated to do that, I'm really a pretty nice guy, but if you're too intimidated to do that, then take the little flap on your bulletin, that connection card, and fill it out. Hand it to me. Hand it to one of our greeters. We will get in touch with you this week and talk to you more about that important decision. Now, I also know that most of you here have probably already made that decision in your life. And for you, I want to encourage you to think about the things that you've learned over the last 6 weeks. It would take some time, I'll admit, but I think it'd be a profitable exercise to go through the sermons for the last 6 weeks and just look at the applications and see which of those that God might be calling you to do in your life. You can go to the website. You can find video, audio, and text of every sermon for the last 6 weeks. At least you will be able to tomorrow once this one's up there. You can find the outlines on there and just go through the applications and pray over those things. Take some time to do that. Like I say, I know that takes some time. I'm realistic to know that probably not a lot of you are going to take time to do that. But I will promise you, if you'll do that, God will use that in your life to show you how you can pursue Him more closely. And my prayer for all of us this morning as we conclude this series is that you can say, along with me, the Lord is my shepherd, therefore I have everything I need. Let's pray.